Hey, I'm Paul Meyer. I'm an instructor at Grand Canyon University. I teach a lot of different classes in the Christian studies area. At this time, I'd like to look a little bit at the introduction to the Gospel of Matthew. This is very debated in terms of in what order the Gospels were written. I would say the majority of scholars would say that Mark was written first. The traditional order of the books as presented in the New Testament is what was accepted also as the chronicle order of when they were written. So there are huge difficulties, complexities. If you do, as I do, say that Matthew was written first, because there are several narratives within Matthew that seem to be way too closely related to Mark if there wasn't some sharing of materials. And you may recall that, by the way, Luke even mentions that he used sources in order to write his gospel. But Matthew is very unique. He was a publican, that is a tax collector, but he was also a Levite, so he was in somewhat of the service yet upper echelons of Jewish society as a publican. What I find is there is no evidence that on the day that Jesus called Matthew from his tax office, that on that very day or in that evening after Matthew had witnessed the teaching and probably healings of Jesus, that he didn't on that evening actually begin to research and write his gospel. So that, to me, leads me to believe that perhaps Matthew was written first, and that's what was believed probably for the first 1,000 years after the Gospels were written. Matthew apparently was written, I would say, prior to 70 A.D. Not many people agree with me on that. You'll find not many people agree with me on anything in terms of the Bible. But here's my view. Matthew writes to Jewish people, and I think most would agree on that. He also writes to demonstrate the Jewishness of Jesus, next his descendancy from Abraham, and finally to show that he is in the messianic line, that he is in the royal line of Israel. Those things he wants to get across to Jewish people. In doing so, what he does is he uses a lot of Old Testament prophecy to point to Jesus as the Messiah, as ultimately the King of Israel. So he writes that, uses Jesus' prophecy, uses Old Testament prophecy, and he shows that because of this, there's a connection between who Jesus is and what was predicted about him in the Old Testament. Okay, where that leads me is to the reality that Matthew does not mention the 70 A.D. or CE, depending on how woke you are, destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Remember, Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24. So to me, if he wrote it after 70 A.D., he would certainly have mentioned, oh, by the way, you see the temple's destroyed just as Jesus said. So it just, to me, is very logical and seems appropriate that Matthew wrote before then. Also, it seems when Matthew was called from the tax office, he was not a younger man, as some movies choose to show him, but rather he's probably an older man. He's probably one of the older men among the 12 apostles. We don't know that, but there just seems to be some evidence that he wouldn't have had his position as a publican if he was just a young man. Rather, he would have that because he had a certain age and he was not of a, if you will, radical sort. So he was willing to work with his captors, if you will, the Roman soldiers. There was probably regularly a Roman soldier at his tax office to make sure things went well. So Matthew writes, and he opens with the only gospel actually that opens with the genealogy of Jesus, is where he came from. Now Luke does it, but he'll do it in chapter 2. Matthew does it right away in chapter 1. I want to point out one, in my opinion, very interesting thing, again, keeping in mind the background, the context. Matthew is writing as a Jew to Jews, and when he lists the genealogy, he, most of the time, lists men, which would be appropriate. A lot of times the women were eliminated from genealogical lists. Not all the time, but a lot of times they were, because patriarchal society. Although some people think Judaism was more a matriarchal society. I don't know. All I know is he mostly includes men in his list. Of interest, Matthew includes women in his list, very specific ones. Obviously, for each child born, there was a woman involved, but the women that Matthew chooses are very interesting, and if you will, very non-Jewish. Let me just read to you the chapter 1, verses 3 and following in the Gospel of Matthew. Verse 3. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. And Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. And Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David the king. David fathered Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Of course, the next woman mentioned, obviously, will be Mary, who was, in fact, Jewish. None of the other women are Jewish. So I just want to go through them. It's so interesting that Matthew, a Jewish person who would tend to ignore women in a genealogy, not only doesn't ignore them, but he picks out, if you will, the skeletons in Jesus' genealogical closet, if I can say that. So the first person mentioned, the first woman mentioned in this genealogy is Tamar. Tamar was not Jewish. She had become the wife of one of Judah's sons, and that son died. And Judah immediately gave her to another son. That was Jewish law. That son died also. Judah, dare I say, ignorant man that he was, felt that this was Tamar's fault. And so he would not give her his third son, a guy named Shelah. And Tamar quietly took exception to that. And so what she does, she goes down to the local house of prostitution at the time when the men who were shepherds were shearing their sheep. And so this was not just a shearing the sheep thing, but it was a big party time for those that were shepherds. And in the party, Tamar comes out dressed as a prostitute, and Judah decides to buy her services, and by so doing, she becomes pregnant. Well, Judah is kind of happy when he finds out she's pregnant. He says, let's light a fire and burn her, because that's the appropriate thing to do. Oddly, it was not the appropriate thing to do. Only a priest's daughter would be burned at the stake if she was caught committing adultery. And it looks like Tamar said, and Tamar had been gifted some significant things, some kind of jewelry, stuff, the staff, that indicated that they very clearly came from Judah. And so when he says, light the fire, she says, hey, light the fire for two, because you were in this too. Whose staff is this, and whose signet ring is this? She had been gifted that because, of course, Judah, being a man, forgot to bring any money. And anyway, so he lost those things and kind of gave up on retrieving them, but Tamar kept them, and when it was found out she was pregnant, he threatens, which he has the right to do, to kill her, and she says, fine, you got to kill the fellow I was in bed with. Oh, by the way, that's Judah. So that had to be pretty embarrassing, and so it's kind of an embarrassing story, but in this way, Tamar, not a Jewish person, not an Israelite by any means, she actually comes into the line of Christ. Apparently she had this insight, perhaps given by God, that said, hey, there is something significant about the line of Judah. He was the royal line of Israel. So anyway, that's Tamar. The second female that mentioned is Rahab. And Rahab is not Jewish. She was, if you will, the black sheep of a black sheep nation. She was in Jericho. Jericho was destined to fall. She watches over and takes care of the Israeli spies. And she says, okay, this is Rahab, when you guys come and conquer the city, remember me and don't destroy me with the city. Here's an amazing thing. If you looked at the history of Jericho, which I don't know if they had the ability to go back this far, but only 500 years before had Jericho fallen. And yet Rahab, never been to Sunday school, never read a verse of scripture as far as we know, but she was convinced that the God of Israel was in charge, which he was and is. And so she says, remember me, spare me and my family. And they said, okay, we'll spare you and everybody in your house. So here's Rahab. Runs a house of prostitution. So this is two prostitutional sort of women that are in Jesus' genealogy. And she is said, everybody in your house will be spared. So she goes out and gathers together her brothers, her sisters, her father, her mother, and says, hey, got to come in my house. The city's going to fall. But wait, it hasn't fallen for 500 years. But she's convinced, and she convinces them. So her testimony, I would have loved to have heard it. But she convinces her brothers, and maybe even her brothers-in-law, hey, got to come into my house. Well, these are guys that are supposed to guard the wall. They're supposed to be on the wall if the walls of Jericho are attacked. And so, but she has them in her house. And I can see the king's men coming by and say, Rahab, got anybody in here? And of course, there's a whole crowd in there. And the soldier said, hey, Rahab, and this is my guess, Rahab, your brothers-in-law, they got to come out and get on the wall and guard the wall. And they said, oh, no, thanks. And they said, okay, when we drive out these Israelites, you guys are dead. And again, that's my guess, but I can't see it happening any other way. So, but she, with her testimony, basically convinces her entire family to stay there. The walls of Jericho do fall, and she is spared. Not only that, she's not just spared, but it looks like she marries this man named Salmon, and she gives birth to Boaz, who will later marry Ruth. So 2 women, both in some ways committed to the job of prostitution, or at least Tamar in one way, but Rahab in a much bigger way. But then Ruth is also not Jewish. You may remember the story. It's just a great 4-chapter book, the book of Ruth. And in it, 2 of, I think his name was Eleazar's sons and him go to Moab because there's a famine in Israel. They end up marrying 2 women there. Remember, it was Oprah. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Orpah. Oprah's mom was wrong in calling her Orpah. But anyway, it sounds easier to pronounce anyway. So the 2 sons die. So you have Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, and Orpah's mother-in-law. And Naomi says, hey, I'm heading back to Israel. Ruth and Orpah say, we're going with you. Orpah finally leaves when Naomi says, you might as well leave. There is no way I can take care of you guys. And Ruth says, no, I'm staying with you. Your people are going to be my people, and your God's going to be my God. So she demonstrates a lot of faith. And by the way, the timing of the book of Ruth is the times of Judges. We don't know who was judge during this period of time, or judges, because judges didn't necessarily rule over the entirety of Israel. But so in the book of Judges, the key statement is, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Not good. Because Judges turns out to be the bloodiest book in the Bible. But here we go. So she lives in a time when everyone does what was right in their own eyes. But Ruth does what's right in the eyes of God. And obviously this is a great encouragement to us that culture is going to push us in one direction. And the reality is that God's principles guide us in a totally different direction. And that's the direction she's willing to go. So Ruth, a Moabite, gets into the line of Christ. She makes decisions that follow the principles of God, and so she is welcomed, if you will, as one of the ancestors of the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's interesting that Matthew picks these three women, and of course the final one is Bathsheba. You recall that David committed adultery with her, although she was somebody else's wife. He murders Uriah and marries Bathsheba. Their first child dies, but then Bathsheba ultimately gives birth to Solomon, and he becomes king of Israel when David passes away. So again, she's a non-Israeli. She's probably, being she's married to a Hittite, she's probably a Hittite. She's one of these cursed people. All of these four women were among cursed nations in a big sense. And yet, Matthew chooses to be honest to the history, and he lists those four women in the genealogy of Jesus, who he is trying to prove is in reality the Messiah of Israel, ultimately the King of Israel. So Matthew is a very interesting writer that he chooses to do this as a Jewish religious leader. He includes these four women that are not only non-Israeli, they're, living among and part of cursed people. By the way, what this shows us, and I've met people that are worried about, hey, I've been cursed or something like that. I said, don't worry about it. Lots of cursed people are blessed by God when they follow the principles of God. And perhaps that's what we can get out of this. As Matthew writes, this includes these four women as well as Mary. He's writing to show that if you follow the principles of God, God will see fit in some way to bless you. It's so easy to follow the ways of the world or do what's right in our own eyes, but the encouragement that Matthew gives is do what's right in the eyes of God, and you will find his blessing. Hope you enjoyed this, and contact me if you have any questions or comments about this short video.